Greatest Ancient Warrior Cultures. The episodes of war and human conflicts are persistent, and it comes to the rich tapestry of history. And in such a vast ambit of wanton destruction and death, there have been a few civilizations, tribes and factions that had accepted warfare as an intrinsic part of their culture. So without further ado, let us take a gander at 10 of the incredible ancient warrior cultures that pushed forth the art of war as an extension of their social system. Note 1, in this list, we are not implying the 10 greatest ancient warrior cultures, but rather implying 10 of the greatest ancient warrior cultures. Preference for choosing the said cultures is partly based on their variant geographical power centers. Note 2, the list doesn't reflect the culture's successes in battles or wars, but it pertains to how they perceived the scope of war or conflict. 1. The Akkadian Warrior, circa 24th century, 22nd century BC. Circa 2334 BC, the Akkadians carved up the first known All-Mesopotamian Empire, thereby momentously uniting the speakers of both Sumerian and Akkadian. In fact, by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the Akkadians managed to create a culturally syncretic scope that encompassed a melting pot of different ethnicity and city-states, which ultimately paved the way for the emergence of Akkadian as the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for many centuries to come. However, beyond just cultural affiliations with the advanced Sumerians, the Akkadians also adopted, and loaned, many of the military systems and doctrines of their Mesopotamian brethren. One example of such transmission of military ideas relates to how the Akkadians probably fought in a phalanx-like formation long before the Greeks, as did the soldiers of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash. This tactic in itself alludes to how the soldiers of Akkad must have been disciplined and trained, thus hinting at their professional status, as opposed to most ancient armies. A few steles also showcase how the Akkadians, and their preceding Sumerians, made use of the armored cloak, a panoply that probably consisted of a leather skin, or cloth, reinforced with metal discs, and helmets for further protection in brutal melee combats. But the practical superiority of the Akkadian, and Sumerian, warrior culture must have related to the use of wheels, an invention that not only allowed for more complex logistical support but also heralded the development of chariots, the ponderous heavy shock weapons of the Bronze Age. Moreover, Sargon of Akkad, possibly the first known military dictator of an empire, implemented the use of composite bows in his otherwise lightly armed citizen army. Historically, the effective range and punch of such powerful bows, in the hands of skilled archers, surely must have given the Akkadians the military advantage over their Sumerian neighbors, many of whom still relied on javelins. 2. The Hittite Warrior, 1600 BC, 1178 BC. Almost 3,700 years ago, a power rose in central Anatolia, thus effectively making its presence felt in the ancient Near Eastern world. Historians term the realm as the Kingdom of Hittite, and its inhabitants are known as the Hittites. By late 14th century BC, the Hittites probably controlled the most powerful empire of the Bronze Age, with their dominions stretching all the way across Anatolia to touch the Aegean Sea, while being complemented on the east with their expansions into Syria, and finally even Mesopotamia, with the defeat of their longtime rivals, the Mitanni. Interestingly enough, the martial culture of the Hittites was often represented by their kings, who were also the commanders-in-chief of their armies. In essence, kingship was intrinsically tied to the display of martial prowess and commanding capability on the battlefields, and as such the kings were expected to prove themselves in battles. Because of such an ingrained cultural aspect, the future candidates for kingship and other elite political roles were often trained in warfare skills from their childhood. To that end, much like warlords, many of the Hittite kings led their troops in the thick of the battle and possibly even engaged in melee combat with the enemy. However, in most practical scenarios, the ruler probably donned his role as a commander and directed his troops from protected vantage points. As for the composition of their armies, most of the Hittite infantrymen were lightly armed with spears and rudimentary shields. But much like other contemporary powers, of both Near East and the Mediterranean, the elite section of the Hittite army was composed of chariots. In that regard, by the time of the momentous Battle of Kadesh, circa 1274 BC, the Hittites probably modified their chariot-based tactics by placing 3 men on the vehicle, as opposed to 2 men. And while this made the chariot more ponderous, it was compensated by the extra protection offered by a shield-bearer who guarded the other 2 armed with throwing spears and bow and arrows. This technique, though risky, might have been instrumental in shattering the first division of their Egyptian foes, thus providing the Hittites with the initiative in the encounter. 3. The Spartan Warrior, circa 9th century BC, 192 BC. An ancient warrior culture that has often been exaggerated in our popular media, the Spartans nevertheless espoused their brand of rigorous military institutions. In fact, the Spartans, or Lacedaemonians, maintained the only full-time army in all of ancient Greece, while their social structures were geared towards producing hardy soldiers from ordinary citizens. One prime example of such a military-oriented scope obviously pertains to the Agoge, the Spartan regimen for boys that combined both education and military training into one exacting package. The Agoge was mandated for all male Spartans from the age of 6 or 7 when the child grew up to be a boy, Paidan. This meant leaving his own house and parents behind and relocating to the Barak to live with other boys. Interestingly, one of the very first things that the boy learned in his new quarters was the pirish, a sort of dance that also involved the carrying of arms. This was practiced so as to make the Spartan boy nimble-footed even when maneuvering heavy weapons. Along with such physical moves, the boy was also taught exercises in music, the war songs of Terteos, and the ability to read and write. By the time the boy grew up to be 12, he was known as the Myrakian or youth. Suffice it to say, the rigorous scope was notched up a level if the physical exercises increased in a day. The youth also had to cut his hair short and walk barefooted, while most of his clothes were taken away from him. The Spartans believed that such uncompromising measures made the preteen boy tough while enhancing his endurance levels for all climates. In fact, the only bed he was allowed to sleep in the winter was made of reeds that had been plucked personally by the candidate from the river Eurotas Valley. Added to this stringent scope, the youth was intentionally fed with less than adequate food so as to stoke his hunger pangs. This encouraged the youth to sometimes steal food, and on being caught, he was punished, not for stealing the food, but for getting caught. And finally, on turning 18, he was considered as an adult and a soldier of the Spartan society but was still prohibited from entering a marketplace to talk with his fellow adults till the age of 30. In consideration of all these strict rules, Plutarch once observed that the only rest that a Spartan got from training for war was during the actual war. 4. The Assyrian Warrior, Neo-Assyrian Empire 900 BC, 612 BC. In a conventional sense, when we talk about Assyria, our notions pertain mostly to what is known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, or the Late Empire, that ruled the largest empire of the world up till that time, roughly existing from a period of 900 to 612 BC. To that end, many historians perceive Assyria to be among the first superpowers of the ancient world. But as the dictum suggests, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. In that regard, Assyria's rise to power was ironically fueled by the land's initial vulnerability, since it was beset on all sides by enemies including nomadic tribes, hill folks, and even proximate competing powers. And to protect their rich and plump grain lands, the Assyrians systematically devised an effective and well-organized military system, from circa 15th century BC, that could cope with the constant state of aggression, conflicts, and raids, much like the Romans. Over time, The reactionary measures translated into an incredibly powerful military system that was inherently tied to the economic well-being of the state. And the once defenders now turned into aggressors. So in a sense, while the Assyrians formulated their attack is the best defense strategies, the proximate states became more warlike, thus adding to the list of enemies for the Assyrians to conquer. Consequently, when the Assyrians went on a war footing, their military was able to absorb more ideas from foreign powers, which led to an ambit of evolution and flexibility, again much like the later Romans. These tendencies of flexibility, discipline and incredible fighting skills, that ranged from chariots, archers to siege tactics, became the hallmark of the Assyrian warrior culture that triumphed over most of the powerful Mesopotamian kingdoms in Asia by 8th century BC. 5. The Roman warrior, the ancient Roman Republic and Empire, 509 BC, 395 AD. To talk about the ancient Romans in merely 3 paragraphs is indeed a fool's errand. Nevertheless, as most history aficionados would know, the Romans in their greatest extent, circa 117 AD, the year of Emperor Trajan's death, controlled the largest empire in the ancient world, stretching from Spain to Syria and Caucasus, and from North African coasts and Egypt to the northern confines of Britain. These conquests were all the more impressive considering Rome's initial beginning, circa 9th to 8th century BC, as a backwater region that was inhabited by cattle rustlers who made their camps and rudimentary dwellings among the hills and the swamplands. Suffice it to say, the impressive conquests all over Europe, Asia and Africa were fueled by the ancient Roman warrior culture and doctrine that was based on sheer discipline and incredible organizational depth. This was complemented by the inherent Roman ability to adapt and learn from other military cultures. Pertinent examples would include the initial Roman armies that were composed of hoplites, inspired by the Greeks of Magna Graecia. But over time they adopted maniples that were possibly influenced by other Italic people and contemporary social conditions. Finally, this organizational scope gave way to legionaries, an ancient Roman equivalent of professional soldiery that was inspired by a mix of foreign influences, including that of Celts and Spaniards. However, the greatest of Roman strengths probably pertained to their unflinching capacity to make comebacks from balefully disastrous scenarios, because of a unique combination of societal, logistics and warrior culture. A pertinent example relates to how the Battle of Cannae, a single encounter in 216 BC, possibly snatched away a significant chunk of the Roman male population. In terms of sheer numbers, the Bloody Day probably accounted for over 40,000 Roman deaths. The figure is put at 55,000 by Livy, 70,000 by Polybius, which equated to about 80% of the Roman army fielded in the battle. The male population of Rome in 216 BC is estimated to be around 400,000, and thus the Battle of Cannae possibly resulted in the deaths of around 1/10, 1/20 of the Roman male population, considering there were also allied Italic casualties. So objectively, from the numerical context, the Romans lost anywhere between 5 to 10% of their male population in their bloodiest encounter for a single day. And yet they were ultimately victorious in the Second Punic War.